Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
There are moments in television history that don't just end a show, they end an era. Moments that, in the space of a single sketch, a single punchline, a single poorly timed joke, collapse decades of goodwill and audience loyalty into something that can never quite be rebuilt. The Benny Hill Show had survived nearly 4 decades of broadcasting. It had outlasted rival programs, weathered shifting tastes, crossed oceans, and turned a chubby, mischievous comedian from Southampton into one of the most recognized faces on the planet. At its peak, more than 21 million British viewers tuned in every week. It was broadcast across 140 countries. The theme music, that frantic, breathless, joyful tune, became arguably the most recognizable piece of comedy television music ever composed. And then, almost without warning, it was gone. But what really happened? Was it truly one scene, one catastrophic moment, that brought the curtain down on Benny Hill? Or was the cancellation the result of something far deeper? A slow-burning tension between a comedian frozen in time and a world that had quietly moved on without him? The answer, as with most things in the complicated life of Alfred Hawthorne Hill, is not as simple as it first appears. But make no mistake, there was indeed a moment, a specific kind of comedy, a pattern of behavior on screen that finally gave television executives the justification they had been quietly looking for. Tonight, we unpack that moment, trace the roots of the controversy, and tell the full story of how the most watched comedy show in the world was taken off the air for good. To understand how the show ended, you first have to understand the man who built it from nothing. Benny Hill was born Alfred Hawthorne Hill on January 21st, 1924, in Southampton, Hampshire, in the south of England. From the very beginning, performance was in his blood. His grandfather, Henry Hill, had been a circus clown, a man who made his living making strangers laugh in the most physically extravagant way imaginable. That legacy, it would turn out, was not lost on young Alfred. His father ran a surgical appliance shop, which was about as far from show business as you could get. But Benny grew up watching, absorbing, and quietly dreaming. He attended Taunton School in Southampton, where he showed no particular academic distinction, but demonstrated an early gift for making people laugh. After leaving school, he drifted through an extraordinary variety of jobs, working at Woolworths, driving a milk float, operating a bridge, and even playing drums in a local band. Each of these experiences gave him something valuable, an understanding of ordinary people, ordinary frustrations, and the kind of humor that comes from everyday humiliation and misfortune. That understanding would become the engine of his comedy for the rest of his life. His path into entertainment began in the theater, where he took a job as an assistant stage manager with a touring revue. It was unglamorous, behind-the-scenes work, but it placed him in the world he had always wanted to inhabit. He learned how shows were built from the ground up, the timing, the staging, the rhythm of a well-constructed sketch. These were lessons he would never forget. When World War II arrived, Hill was called up for military service. He trained as a mechanic with the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers and later served as a truck driver and searchlight operator, eventually landing in Normandy in September 1944. But fate had other plans for him. Before the war ended, he transferred to the Combined Services Entertainment Division, where he performed for Allied troops. It was in those makeshift theaters, performing for tired and homesick soldiers, that Benny Hill discovered something important about himself. He could hold a room. He could make people forget, if only for a few minutes, that the world outside was falling apart. He adopted the stage name Benny as a tribute to his favorite comedian, Jack Benny, the great American master of timing and deadpan delivery. It was an apt choice. Like Jack Benny, the man who would become Benny Hill understood instinctively that comedy is not just about the joke. It is about the pause before the joke. It is about the look on your face when the audience already knows what is coming, but you pretend not to. It is about creating a world so recognizable and so absurd that people cannot help but surrender to it. On January 15th, 1955, the Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC, and British television was never quite the same again. The show drew heavily from the tradition of British music hall entertainment, that rowdy, irreverent, wonderfully democratic form of variety performance that had entertained working-class audiences for a century. It combined live sketches with pre-recorded segments, giving Hill the flexibility to construct elaborate visual gags that simply could not have been achieved on a purely live broadcast. From the very first episode, it was clear that this was something different. Hill's comedy was physical, fast, layered with double meanings, and punctuated by an almost childlike delight in absurdity. His regular collaborators during those early BBC years included Patricia Hayes, Jeremy Hawke, Peter Vernon, Ronnie Brody, and co-writer Dave Freeman, who played an enormous role in shaping the material throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. But perhaps the most beloved figure from that era was Jackie Wright, a small, bald, perpetually beleaguered actor who became famous as the target of Hill's relentless head-slapping routines. Wright's perfectly timed stoicism in the face of Hill's cheerful cruelty was comedy gold, and audiences adored him for it. A significant turning point arrived in 1969, when the show moved from the BBC to Thames Television. This transition was transformative. Instead of regular weekly episodes, the show now aired as longer one-hour specials, which gave Hill far more room to develop his ideas. The production values improved dramatically. The sketches became more elaborate, and crucially, the show began to reach audiences far beyond Britain. Eventually, the Benny Hill Show would be broadcast in over 140 countries, making Hill one of the few British comedians to achieve genuine global stardom. In the United States particularly, the Thames Television version found enormous success through syndication in the late 1970s and early 1980s, introducing millions of American viewers to Hill's particular brand of cheerful mayhem. The show's most iconic recurring element was the chase sequence that closed almost every episode, set to the manic pace of Yakety Sax by Boots Randolph, a piece of music so completely associated with Hill that it became known simply as the Benny Hill theme. These sequences featured Hill and a rotating cast of characters engaged in breathless, sped-up pursuit across parks, streets, and corridors. The footage was shot using a technique called undercranking, which involved filming at a slower frame rate, so that when played back at normal speed, every movement became exaggerated and frenetic. It was silly, unstoppable, and utterly joyful. In 2015, that theme tune was voted the #1 television theme of all time in an ITV special, a remarkable testament to its staying power. As the 1980s arrived, the show introduced one of its most talked-about elements: Hill's Angels, a troupe of young, attractive women who appeared in both dance routines and comedic sketches. They added glamour and energy to the program, and several of them went on to significant careers of their own. Jane Leeves, who would later become internationally famous as Daphne Moon in the hit American sitcom Frasier, was among the Angels during this period. Sue Upton became one of the longest-serving and most beloved members of the troupe, but the Angels also became the focal point of a gathering storm, because while audiences were still watching, not everyone was laughing anymore. Comedy does not exist in a vacuum. It is always in conversation with the society around it, reflecting its values, testing its limits, and sometimes revealing its most uncomfortable assumptions. For most of its run, the Benny Hill Show sat comfortably within the mainstream of British popular humor. The chasing of women, the leering glances, the relentless focus on bodies and innuendo, these were understood as part of a long tradition of British seaside postcard humor, winking and harmless, belonging to the same world as Candy Floss and Dodgem Cars. The audience knew it was a game, and so did the performers. But something began to shift in British culture during the late 1970s and early 1980s. A new generation of comedians was emerging, sharp, politically aware, self-conscious about the power of comedy to shape attitudes. They called themselves alternative comedians, and they were deeply uncomfortable with the old ways. Where Benny Hill saw innocent mischief, they saw the reinforcement of damaging stereotypes. Where he saw tradition, they saw a barrier to progress, and they were increasingly vocal about making that argument in public. The sketches that drew the most criticism during this period were those featuring the beauty pageant format, elaborately constructed scenes in which women were paraded, evaluated, and subjected to the kind of leering, objectifying humor that had always been a central part of Hill's comedic vocabulary. One particularly controversial sketch from the late 1980s became a flashpoint in this growing debate. In the sketch, Hill appeared as a judge at a beauty competition, and the humor derived almost entirely from the ogling and objectification of the female participants. It was crude, it was obvious, and by the standards of the time it had become, it was indefensible. What might have generated knowing laughter a decade earlier now generated complaints. The Broadcasting Standards Council took notice. Newspaper columnists began to sharpen their pens. And inside Thames Television, executives who had been growing quietly restless with the show's direction had a new and very public controversy on their hands. The man who most loudly gave voice to the criticism was Ben Elton, the sharp-tongued alternative comedian, who had become one of the most prominent voices of his generation through his appearances on the television program Saturday Live. Elton made headlines when he publicly accused the Benny Hill Show of contributing to a culture of violence and disrespect toward women. He argued that the show's relentless portrayal of women as objects of pursuit and ridicule was not simply harmless fun, but actively harmful, that it normalized attitudes which made women feel unsafe in public spaces, and that television had a responsibility to reckon with what it was putting into the world. His comments appeared not only on television, but in the January 1987 issue of Q magazine, where they reached an even wider audience. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some critics agreed entirely with Elton, arguing that Hill's comedy had always been a cultural symptom of a society that did not take women seriously, and that it was long past time for the show to be held accountable. Others found the criticism excessive and even cruel. A writer in The Independent described Elton's public attack on Hill as resembling the spectacle of watching an elderly relative being set upon by younger, stronger opponents, suggesting that whatever the merits of the argument, there was something disproportionate about targeting a gentle, aging comedian with such ferocity. GQ magazine was even more blunt, comparing the logic of blaming Benny Hill for social problems to blaming concert pianists for unrelated atrocities. A reductio ad absurdum of the argument that media representations directly cause real-world harm. Interestingly, Ben Elton later appeared to acknowledge the limits of his own position, at least indirectly. In the comedy series Harry Enfield and Chums, he was parodied as a character called Benny Elton, a pompous, humorless enforcer of political correctness who was ultimately chased by furious women to the strains of yakety sax in a sequence that directly mirrored the very Benny Hill format he had spent years condemning. It was a moment of genuine self-awareness, and it suggested that the debate had always been more complicated than either side wanted to admit. But the damage had been done. The public debate, however nuanced in its details, had attached a specific and damaging narrative to the Benny Hill Show, that it was not just old-fashioned but actively harmful. That narrative gave Thames Television the cover it needed to make a decision that, in truth, had probably been coming for years. In 1989, Thames Television canceled the Benny Hill Show. The official explanation cited the changing landscape of British television comedy and a desire to make room for newer programming. But those who knew the situation understood that the decision had been building for years. The show had become a liability, not commercially, because it still attracted substantial audiences, but reputationally. In an era of increasing public scrutiny of media content, Thames Television did not want to be seen as the broadcaster defending a program that prominent voices were characterizing as damaging to women. The controversy had made the show untouchable, and the executives moved quickly and quietly to bring it to an end. For Benny Hill, the cancellation was devastating. He had dedicated his entire adult life to the program, writing the material, performing it, refining it, pouring every creative instinct he possessed into each special. The show was not just his work, it was his identity. Without it, he struggled to find purpose or direction. Friends and colleagues noticed a profound change in him after 1989. He became withdrawn and despondent, seemingly unable to reconcile himself to the idea that the world he had built had been dismantled so suddenly and with so little ceremony. There were conversations about revivals, about new formats, about finding a way to bring Hill back to screens in a form that would satisfy both his creative instincts and the demands of a changed cultural climate. None of these conversations came to anything. On April 20th, 1992, Benny Hill was found dead at his home in Teddington, having suffered a heart attack. He was 68 years old. He died by most accounts, a lonely and heartbroken man, wealthy but isolated, famous but forgotten by the industry that had once celebrated him. The contrast between the frantic, laughing, larger-than-life figure on screen and the quiet, solitary man he had become in his final years is one of the saddest stories in British entertainment history. And yet the story does not end in sadness. Because Benny Hill's work endured, the sketches that had once been dismissed as outdated and offensive were rediscovered by new generations of comedy fans who found in them not a manual for sexism, but a record of a very specific and very British comedic tradition, broad, physical, anarchic, and irreverently human. The debate about whether his humor was harmful or harmless continues to this day, and there is no clean resolution to it. The truth, as always, sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. What is beyond dispute is the scale of his achievement. At his peak, Benny Hill was watched by 21 million people in Britain alone. His show reached 140 countries. His theme music became the universal shorthand for comic chaos. He won a BAFTA for his writing. He inspired generations of comedians around the world who grew up watching those frantic chase sequences and those elaborate, carefully constructed parodies. He was, in every measurable sense, one of the most successful entertainers Britain ever produced. The scene that finally took the Benny Hill show off the air was not a single catastrophic failure of judgment. It was the last in a long series of moments that revealed a comedian who had remained faithful to a vision of comedy that the world around him had outgrown. Whether that was a tragedy or simply the natural end of an era depends entirely on where you stand. But one thing is certain. When that final chase sequence faded from British screens in 1989, something irreplaceable went with it, and television has never quite found its way back to that particular kind of